Hi, and welcome to Somatic Wise, where people rejoin the natural world and help each other heal. Today's video is about difference, specifically why biodiversity, human diversity, and anti-racism work are so vitally important to the well-being of life on this planet. So biodiversity refers to there being many different forms of life, not all the same. Human diversity, of course, refers to biodiversity or differences among humans. And there are so many kinds of diversity among humans, from how we look, to how we think, behave, our cultural traditions, and so much more. So why is this so important? It's not just to be politically correct. It's not just to impress that hot chick. It's not even just to check the diversity training box at work and get that promotion. And it's not even just to make your neighbor quit grumbling so that we can all get along, sort of. It goes much deeper than that. I mean, something most people don't even stop to think about is diversity is vitally important to all life on Earth. I care deeply about life on Earth, and so that's why I'm making this video. Let's start with biodiversity in the greater than human world, and then let's see how it applies to our everyday human lives. We human critters are not as different from the rest of nature as we might like to think. Just like every other animal, our bodies are made from what we ate, which is literally the stuff of Earth, plants, soils, water, etc. And just like all the other life on Earth, we are completely dependent on Earth's cycles of air, climate, water, solar energy, soils, etc. Without that, there's no us. So we have created a bunch of fancy differences between us and other animals. Nevertheless, the very same principles that drive other ecosystems also drive our very lives. And the take-home idea here is the more diversity and complexity in a living system, and the more different ways there are to solve problems, the more resilient that system will be. So let's look at that for a moment with a few examples. You might have heard of monocrops. That's when they plant a whole bunch of the same plant in one area, and the idea is to make more yield, more corn, more wheat, what have you. So that can be economically beneficial. However, monocrops are known to fall victim to pests and diseases because they do not have enough genetic difference so that some of the plants can fend off the threats. That's why many pesticides were developed, in fact. However, when you have a smaller farm that uses permaculture principles, including careful soil care and crop rotation, that means the entire system is stronger and doesn't share the same vulnerabilities. That's biodiversity. It's also systemically based thought instead of linear thinking. Another example is it lies in human reproduction. And the underlying reason that reproduction with family members is generally considered taboo across most cultures is because with less shuffling of the gene pool, you tend to get organisms that can have lower genetic diversity, and that can lead to many biological problems. A similar example lies between wolves and purebred dogs, who are known to suffer from many genetic problems. Because when you breed from a small pool to select for specific traits, it weakens them. It's just stronger to have more diversity because there are more potential solutions to problems. So now let's jump over to systems of human psychology. Diversity of thought and perspective leads to much stronger thinking and more solutions. One example lies in my home state of California, and as you probably know, here in the American West, we've been suffering from tremendous mega forest fires. And that's because of wrong thinking about forest management, which basically started in the early 1900s until more recently, and also due to climate change and invasive species. So in the early 1900s, throughout most of that century, they just worked harder and harder to suppress forest fires. And apparently, there weren't too many people being curious about other options or how it was that the forest has managed to survive so long before colonization. So finally, fire officials in the state have begun partnering with indigenous folks for wildfire management, asking the assistance of people who lived sustainably with the lands for centuries and who understand fire management. And now there are controlled burns to use up the excess fuel and create more fertile soils. In so doing, the state is finally accepting and acting on the fact that diversity of thoughts, perspective, and knowledge can create solutions. Whereas when the state had been sticking with one particular way of thinking, shutting down other ways, it really did turn out to be wrong. Another example of diversity of thought strengthening human psychological and other systems is in neurodiversity. And neurodiversity, that is different patterns of thinking, behaving, and being in the world, that is becoming more widely recognized and fortunately more widely supported. There are a lot of amazing thinkers who have tentatively or clearly been identified as being neurodiverse, or at the very least out of the box. The Harvard Business Review put out an article saying that neurodiversity creates substantial gains in companies. They name productivity gains, more innovation, quality improvement, more employee engagement. Now, this is not woo-woo thought, folks. This is the Harvard Business Review. Doing the same old thing inherently creates vulnerability to threats, whereas complexity and difference creates resilience. Now, some resistance to accepting difference is in the fact that we do all have to learn to get along. It's not as convenient to have to deal with differences, goes one line of thinking. I've heard people say things like, why should I put up with those traditions, rituals, different ways of expressing themselves, etc.? Well, in actuality, not only does learning about differences deeply enrich our lives, it makes each of us stronger and more resilient as well. Psychotherapists know that we people are completely interdependent on each other, so many more ways than I have time to go into in this video, and that the experiences we have with each other can become mirrors for learning about ourselves and truly growing stronger. Living among human diversity makes us more flexible, more adaptive, more curious, more open, more receptive about other people and about the world. I guess the real downside is when people don't want to do the work of challenging the implicit biases that we all have due to growing up with these lines of thought. It is absolutely true that it takes a lot of energy to do this internal work, and that it's very difficult to resolve deep and long-standing disagreements between peoples, especially because they're usually based in long-standing cycles of deep trauma. However, ongoing fragmentation and conflict is really proving to not be a good answer. This is a basic fundamental principle of all life on this planet, that there is a lot of biodiversity that all depends upon each other, and that the more diversity there is, the stronger the living system. So really, this is about life, the value of life, preserving life across all levels on this gorgeous jewel of a planet, which is, as far as we know, the only place in a big empty vacuum of space that holds life. So now let's talk about why anti-racism work specifically is such a vitally important aspect of supporting biodiversity and the well-being of life on the planet. It's not only because racism is against the principles of biodiversity that we've just reviewed, which is deeply embedded in everyone's biology, and it's not only because it's deeply damaging, life-ending in fact, to those who must endure it. It is a lie that we are living. It is not accurate. We're all living with this great big malignant lie which continues to perpetuate a lot of pain. This is something everybody needs to know. Racism was literally invented a few hundred years ago. Basically, there was a Portuguese prince and slave trader named Prince Henry the Navigator, and he wanted to exclusively trade slaves from West Africa. He did this in order to circumvent, literally going around, the Islamic slave traders who were capturing and enslaving people of every color. So then, a few years later, Prince Henry's chronicles were written down by the biographer and historian Gomes de Zurara. In that book, de Zurara lumped all the diverse peoples of Africa into one category and basically wrote that they were ugly, stupid, and primitive. It's hard for me to even say that. This lie was him inventing the hierarchy he needed for Henry's purposes, which were to push evangelical Christianity, since Africans were somehow bad and in need of saving, and enslave people for massive economic benefit for Portugal. He did this quite unscientifically. Africa is a huge continent, and its people were and still are very diverse. And Africa had some of the world's most sophisticated civilizations at this time. So de Zurara was documenting and justifying and glorifying Henry's actions and this documented creation of racism. Then this idea of hierarchy based on skin color and where you came from really took off in the late 17th century. This was because the American colony plantations needed more labor, and Europeans didn't want to come over to the New World in sufficient numbers for the demands of production. The issue was that England wanted more production to compete with India in the global textile trade. Before racism was invented like this, there was trauma. There were class differences. There was trauma and brutality and enslavement. The world was actually pretty brutal. But there weren't these deep hierarchical divisions between white versus black versus brown, etc. Some people point to the Tower of London as a historical landmark representative of how normal it was to torture people in England at that time. The content for this section of my video draws on three amazing thinkers, writers, and historians, all of whom are highly credentialed and recognized. Links to citations in the comments section. Resma Medicam, a fellow somatic experiencing practitioner like myself and very vital in the anti-racism work and community, Dr. Ibrahim Kendi, who has some amazing credentials and very prolific author, and Robert Marks, a historian who wrote the History of the Modern World. Wonderful book. The strong messages about other races that permeate modern Western culture are basically impossible to avoid. Even good, well-intentioned folks cannot help carrying some of this stuff. This is why we all need to work to undo the lies that ingrain themselves. So I invite you to ask yourself, as I continue to ask myself every day, do you want to continue to carry this legacy, especially being a pawn to murderous and exploitative interests based on a huge lie invented by these people who are now long dead? Continuing to carry and live out injurious messages that massively continue to hurt others? Some people are surprised to learn that internalized racism even hurts those who are at the top of this artificially constructed hierarchy. There's a whole body of work on this, but this is from my own experience in doing my somatic experiencing and anti-racism work. It turns out carrying an internalized fight or flight response against entire masses of people who you don't even know and who in reality are very different from one another, turns out that's internally painful and stressful. I discovered this as a happy side effect of my own work. I could feel my nervous system letting go of stress and tension as I did the work, and I relaxed inside quite a bit. There was now a possibility of connection instead of automatic stress and alienation. I'll end this video with a quote from one of the great thinkers and authors of our time, James Baldwin. And Baldwin says, "I imagine one of the reasons that people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." Thank you so much for watching Somatic Wise. Take good care and remember to do what is beautiful and what lights you up inside. Till next time. Thank you for watching Somatic Wise. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, because that will help YouTube show this to more people. Till next time, take care.